In the middle of London, in broad daylight, a man leaned toward an open upper-floor window, raised a rifle, and fired it out over a crowded street. Nobody looked up. Not one person on the pavement below flinched or stopped or turned to find the sound, because there was no sound to find. Nothing they could name as a gunshot, and that was the entire point. The men who set this up weren't watching the target. They were watching the crowd. British intelligence wanted the answer to a single question. If you fired this rifle in the heart of a living, breathing city, would anyone down there hear it? They didn't. A weapon had just been discharged in central London, and the war walking past on the street below never knew. To understand why a country would build a gun that could be fired unnoticed in its own capital, you have to go back to the worst year Britain ever had. By the summer of 1940, it was over on the continent. Hitler had rolled through one country after another, and the British Army had been thrown back into the sea at Dunkirk, leaving its guns and vehicles behind on the beaches. Britain was alone, outmatched, and shut out of Europe. So Churchill stopped fighting the war the way everyone expected. He ordered the creation of the Commandos, small raiding parties who would slip ashore at night behind enemy lines to sabotage, to gather intelligence, and to disappear before dawn. And almost immediately, these men hit the same wall over and over again. The sentry, every target worth raiding, every radar post, every fuel dump, every coastal gun, had a guard standing in front of it. And the guard himself was never really the problem. The problem was the sound he made when he died. One rifle shot in the dark doesn't kill one man. It wakes 100. It turns a silent infiltration into a running gun battle against an entire garrison, miles inland, with no way back to the boats. For a commando, noise wasn't just danger. Noise was the difference between coming home and not. So they needed something almost paradoxical. A way to erase a man without making the sound of erasing him. They already had silenced weapons. None of them were good enough. The suppressed Sten still clattered, its bolt slamming back and forth with every shot, a mechanical racket no silencer could ever swallow. The well rod, a strange bolt-action assassination pistol, was genuinely quiet, but it was a whisper you had to press almost against your target, and its soft internal parts wore out after only a handful of rounds. What combined operations actually wanted didn't exist anywhere on Earth. They wanted the reach and accuracy of a rifle, out to 100, 200 meters, with less noise than a child's air gun, and they wanted it to keep working, shot after shot, deep in enemy territory where nothing could be fixed. Every engineer who read that list said the same word: impossible. And to be fair to them, they had physics on their side. Because a gunshot isn't one sound, it's three, stacked on top of each other, and each one is born a different way. The first is the muzzle blast, a burst of superheated high-pressure gas erupting out behind the bullet the instant it leaves the barrel. The second is the crack of the bullet itself, if it flies faster than sound, dragging a small sonic boom along the entire length of its flight. And the third is the weapon, the metal slamming, cycling, ejecting, the machine announcing its own work with every shot. A normal silencer only fights the first of those three. Muffle the muzzle, and you've still left two voices screaming. To make a rifle truly, completely silent, you can't just quiet a gunshot. You have to reach in and kill all three at the source. And if that's the part that grips you, not the war, but the puzzle buried underneath it, the idea that you could out-engineer physics itself, then stay with me and subscribe, because from here, this stops being a story about an army at all. Because the man who solved it, who quietly, almost by accident, silenced all three voices of a gunshot, wasn't a weapons designer. He didn't work for an arms company. He was a civil servant at the Air Ministry with an unusual hobby. For years, in his spare time, he'd been building silencers with his own hands. Not for war, not for spies, but so he could slip into the countryside and shoot rabbits without anyone ever knowing he'd been there. He had no idea that a habit born out of poaching was about to become the most secret weapon Britain fielded in the Second World War. He wasn't trying to win a war. He was trying not to wake the neighbors. Long before any of this reached a soldier, William Godfrey de Lisle spent his free weekends doing something a gentleman of the Air Ministry probably shouldn't admit to: slipping out to poach rabbits. And a rabbit is a nervous animal in a nervous field. Fire one loud shot, and the whole meadow empties in a heartbeat. Every ear in the grass gone before you can work the bolt for a second. So de Lisle, who was an engineer by trade and a tinkerer by nature, built himself a solution by hand, a silencer of his own design, fitted to a little .22 Browning. But the thing that made him dangerous wasn't the silencer. It was the way he thought about it. To the Army's engineers, a silencer was an afterthought, a fat tube you screwed onto the end of a finished gun to muffle the bark. De Lisle came at it from the opposite direction entirely. He didn't think of the silencer as an accessory. He thought of the whole weapon as one continuous machine for producing silence, from the cartridge all the way to the muzzle. Out in that field, with a slow little round, and a gun built around quiet from the start, he got it down to almost nothing. The rabbit dropped. The rest of the field never even lifted its head. That was the secret hiding in a poacher's hobby. And it might have stayed a hobby forever, if it hadn't been for the man living nearby. Because de Lisle's neighbor happened to be one of the most famous men in Britain. Sir Malcolm Campbell, the land speed record holder, the daredevil behind the Bluebird machines, a genuine national celebrity who had driven faster across the earth than almost anyone alive. What the newspapers didn't print was that Campbell was also an officer inside Combined Operations, the very department scouring the country for a silent weapon that didn't exist. And one day, he heard the strangest rumor about the quiet man next door, that he'd been killing game without making a sound. Campbell got his hands on the little rifle and fired it toward the Thames. He couldn't believe what he wasn't hearing. He brought it straight to the military. Their verdict was blunt and honestly fair. A .22 is a toy. It might drop a rabbit, but it wouldn't reliably stop a grown man in a greatcoat. If de Lisle wanted this taken seriously as a weapon of war, it had to fire something with real weight behind it. So Combined Operations handed him a demand that very nearly strangled the whole idea in its crib. Make it 9mm, a proper standard military pistol round. And de Lisle built it, and it failed. It failed loudly in every sense. But that failure handed him the single most important law of the entire project, the rule that everything after would be built around. 9mm flies faster than sound. And this is where the whole thing collides with the hardest wall in the physics of silence. You can tame the gas at the muzzle perfectly. You can wrap the barrel in the finest silencer ever machined. And it will not matter at all, because a supersonic bullet doesn't make its worst noise at the gun. It makes it in the open air, meters down range, cracking a tiny sonic boom across the whole length of its flight. That sound is created out there, in the sky, where no silencer on Earth can follow it. So de Lisle learned the thing that separated him from every engineer who called this impossible. Silence doesn't begin with the silencer. It begins with the bullet. If the round itself won't stay under the speed of sound, nothing you bolt onto the gun can save you. And that one rule threw most of the world's ammunition straight into the bin. He needed a round heavy enough to put a man down for good, yet slow enough to stay below the speed of sound entirely on its own, with no clever tricks required. There was exactly one obvious answer, and the quiet genius of it was that Britain was already drowning in the stuff. The American .45, a fat, blunt, heavy slug that had been knocking men flat since before the First World War. And it did all of that while lumbering along at barely 250 meters a second. Comfortably, naturally, permanently subsonic. No boom to chase, no crack in the sky. Better still, crates of it were already flowing into British hands to feed the Thompson guns and Colt pistols sent over from the States. Ammunition supply, the invisible thing that quietly kills half of all brilliant wartime weapons, was solved before Lisle had even begun. He built a third prototype around that fat American round, and this time it worked. But a slow, heavy pistol bullet solves only one half of the puzzle. It buys you silence. It does not, on its own, hand you a rifle. Fired from anything short and crude, the .45 is still just a pistol cartridge, a close-up, arcing, short-reach tool. And Combined Operations hadn't asked for a quiet pistol. They'd asked for something a man could shoulder and trust far out in the dark, well past the range any pistol could dream of. To drag that blunt little round out to a rifle's distance, Lisle needed a rifle's action, a rifle's barrel, a rifle's precision. All of it wrapped inside a silencer large enough to swallow every last thing the weapon still had to say. And he wasn't going to invent all of that from a blank sheet of paper in the middle of a war. So he went looking for a donor, an existing rifle he could gut and rebuild into something silent. And the one he chose was the last weapon in all of Britain anyone would ever have expected him to touch. They didn't hand Lisle a rifle to build, they handed him one to destroy. The Lee Enfield was the most sacred piece of steel in the British arsenal. It was the rifle that had gone over the top in the trenches, the one a generation of soldiers had lived and died with, so trusted that a trained man could work its bolt and put 15 aimed rounds downrange in a minute. To touch it was almost heresy. Lisle took the short magazine Lee Enfield Mark III, laid it on a bench, and began cutting it apart. But this wasn't vandalism. It was the most important decision in the whole design, because of what a bolt-action rifle refuses to do. Every self-loading weapon, every submachine gun pays for its speed with noise. Each shot throws a heavy bolt backward, slams it forward again, rips the spent case out, and flings it clear. A mechanical brawl happening inside the gun with every round. A clatter of steel on steel that no silencer wrapped around the barrel can ever reach. That racket had been the ghost haunting every attempt at a quiet weapon. And the Lee Enfield's bolt simply doesn't make it. Nothing cycles on its own. Nothing slams. The shooter works it by hand, slowly, deliberately, one round at a time. And in that deliberate quiet lay the answer to a voice everyone else had given up on silencing. The machine itself would finally shut up. That was the whole reason for the sacrilege. But choosing the action was the easy part. Now he had to rebuild it around a cartridge it was never meant to hold. The Lee Enfield was born for the long, slim point, .303 rifle round, the fat, stubby point. .45 was a different animal entirely, and forcing one to feed the other meant surgery on nearly every part. Lisle shortened the bolt and cut it a new extractor to grip the wide American case. He tore out the original magazine housing and built a fresh one, so the gun would swallow magazines lifted straight from the Colt 1911 pistol, 7 rounds or 11. On some carbines, he even slipped a small pad beneath the bolt handle, purely to kill the faint clack of metal touching metal as it closed. He was hunting silence down to the last accidental tap of steel. Then came the part that made the weapon look like nothing else on earth. He gave it a barrel only about 8 inches long and buried 2 of those inches back inside the action itself. Then he did something that sounds insane. He drilled that short barrel full of holes, dozens of tiny ports along its length, deliberately bleeding away the very gas that pushes the bullet. It wasn't a mistake. It was the trick that killed the blast. Remember the eruption of superheated gas that follows a bullet out of the muzzle, the first and loudest voice of a gunshot. Lisle refused to fight it at the muzzle, the way an ordinary silencer does, arriving too late. Instead, he attacked it early. As the bullet slides up that drilled barrel, the pressure behind it is already hissing out sideways through the ports, long before the round ever reaches open air. By the time the bullet finally leaves the muzzle, the violent gas that would have cracked like a whip has already been quietly bled away, and all of that escaping gas needed somewhere to go, which is where the strangest feature of the whole weapon comes in. Over that ported barrel, Lisle built an enormous tube, 2 inches across, running the full length of the gun and reaching well past where the muzzle would normally end. It made up roughly half of the entire weapon. Inside sat a stack of metal baffles, disc after disc, forcing the bled-off gas to twist and tumble through a long, convoluted path. But the baffles were only half the genius. The real weapon was the sheer volume of the thing, a vast, cool, cavernous space where the gas could expand, spread out, lose its pressure and its heat, and finally seep out the front as a slow, soft exhale instead of a bang. Fire enough shots and the whole tube grew hot to the touch, hot enough that a wooden guard had to be fitted underneath just so the shooter didn't burn his hand. Now stack up everything Lisle had done. A bullet already too slow to break the sound barrier. A barrel bled dry of pressure before the muzzle. An action that made no mechanical sound at all. 3 separate voices of a gunshot, and each one silenced by a different part of the weapon, not by a single tube bolted on at the end. Put a stopwatch on the result, and the number is almost hard to believe. 85.5 decibels. That's the sound this rifle made. A normal handgun screams out somewhere between 150 and 170. Lisle's carbine landed quieter than a slammed car door, so quiet that when a man fired it, the loudest thing anyone heard wasn't the shot at all. It was the soft, dry click of the firing pin dropping. There was no muzzle flash to betray him in the dark. And unlike the fragile, silent tools that came before it, this one didn't wear out after a handful of shots. It could fire hundreds before it ever needed opening up. Every single line on that impossible list of demands had been met. On paper, Lisle had built the quietest weapon of the entire war. But paper is a workshop, not a battlefield. A number measured on a test range says nothing about what it feels like to carry this thing into occupied France in the black of night. To creep to within 50 meters of an armed enemy who has every reason to expect you, raise a silent rifle, and trust your life to a gun that makes less noise than the wind. That was the question no test bench could answer, and the men about to answer it were already slipping across the channel, 50 meters, in the dark. That's how close a man had to get, because a weapon this quiet didn't turn its user into a sniper, tucked away safe on a distant hill. It turned him into something stranger and far more dangerous. A man who had to close almost to arm's reach of an armed enemy and take him out of the war so softly that the war itself never noticed. And that softness rewrote the whole logic of attacking a guarded position. Normally, the shot is the alarm. It doesn't just drop the sentry. It announces him falling, and a post that hears one of its own go down comes alive all at once. Men running, flares climbing, the whole position awake and hunting. But a man killed by Lisle's carbine set off none of it. He simply stopped existing. He slumped where he stood, and the soldiers only meters away kept talking, kept smoking, kept staring off in the wrong direction, because nothing had told them anything was wrong. The carbine didn't just silence the gun, It silenced the death itself. The first weapons to prove this weren't even from a factory. They were built by hand. The very first 17 carbines were hammered together by the Ford Works at Dagenham, and the story of where is almost too fitting. Malcolm Campbell, the record-breaking neighbor who'd started this whole thing, happened to be a director at that very plant. The machining was done quietly in the factory tool room, and the final assembly of Britain's most secret weapon took place, of all places, inside the manager's own air raid dugout, a bomb shelter turned into a workshop for building silence. Lisle himself was pulled off his air ministry desk and set loose on the project full-time. Those 17 handmade guns didn't sit in a crate waiting for a proper rollout. They went straight into the fight. In the tense months before D-Day, small commando parties were slipping across the channel again and again, creeping onto the Normandy coast to map minefields, probe the defenses, and snatch prisoners before vanishing back to the boats. It was exactly the work the carbine had been dreamed up for. Get in, remove the men who might raise the alarm, get out, and leave the enemy staring at an empty stretch of coast with no idea anyone had ever been there. The gun that had been tested in a London street was now being tested against the Atlantic Wall itself, in the dark, weeks before the largest invasion in history. But the story that captures what this weapon truly was didn't happen in France at all. It happened in the jungles of Burma. Picture a Japanese supply column moving down a jungle track, soldiers strung out along the line of trucks. Somewhere in the green wall on either side, commandos are waiting, spaced along the route, carbines raised. And then men simply begin to fall. One soldier drops, then another further up the line. No crack of a rifle, no flash in the shadows, no direction to run toward, nothing to shoot back at. To the men still walking, there was no attack at all, only their comrades sinking to the ground, one by one, for no reason the living could see or hear. That is a weapon that doesn't just kill a body. It kills the nerve of everyone still breathing. The silence itself became the terror. Word of what these guns could do spread fast enough that Britain wanted them in real numbers. The Sterling Company was handed an order for 500, and here the story takes the turn that would decide the carbine's whole legend. 500 were ordered. Barely 130 were ever finished. The weapon was too good and too late all at once. By the time the production lines were meant to hit full stride, the war itself was visibly ending, and a tool designed for silent killing in occupied Europe suddenly had less and less occupied Europe to work in. The contract, so full of promise, quietly withered. Only a trickle of carbines ever left the line before the whole thing was cut short. You'd think that would be the end of it. A brilliant weapon, half-built and overtaken by peace, destined to be forgotten in a footnote. It was the exact opposite. That unfinished trickle of barely 130 guns is precisely why, 80 years later, the Lisle carbine is spoken about like a ghost, hunted by collectors, mythologized in museums, and still somehow refusing to be beaten at the one thing it was built to do. Barely 130 were ever built, and that was almost enough to erase it completely. A weapon needs a war to justify it, and the Lisle carbine had been born for a very particular kind of war. The silent, dirty, close-up work of raiding an occupied continent. When that continent was liberated, the reason for the gun quietly evaporated with it. There was no peacetime brief for a rifle whose entire purpose was to make men disappear without a sound. The Sterling contract was cut short, the tooling set aside, and the carbine could have slipped straight into a museum drawer as a wartime curiosity that arrived just as its war ended. There was even a version that barely existed at all. Someone had imagined the carbine dropping out of the sky with airborne troops and built a variant with a folding stock that hinged flat for the jump, a paratrooper's silent rifle. Almost none were made. Today, a single surviving example of that folding stock version sits in a British collection, the last physical proof of an idea the war never got around to using. One gun. Oh, that is the entire surviving population of a whole branch of the design. But the ordinary carbines refuse to die quietly, which, for this particular weapon, is grimly appropriate. The handful that survived the war kept turning up wherever the fighting went quiet and personal. They were carried through the jungles of the Malayan emergency. They surfaced in Korea. There are accounts of them appearing in the shadow wars that came long after, pressed into the hands of special forces decades past the weapon's supposed retirement, still on the books into the 1960s. A gun designed for one specific invasion just kept finding new dark corners of new conflicts, long after the men who dreamed it up had moved on. It behaved exactly like the ghost it's so often compared to, the thing that simply would not leave. And here is the part that turns a rare old rifle into something genuinely mythical. 80 years have passed. 80 years of material science, computer modeling, or precision machining. Entire companies built around nothing but the engineering of silence. And modern suppressed rifles still cannot cleanly beat a carbine that was hammered together by hand while the war was still on. When enthusiasts build faithful reproductions today, the best they tend to meter is around 119 decibels, respectably quiet, and still louder than the original's 85.5. A weapon hand-built in 1943 remains, by many measures, the quietest shoulder-fired firearm ever put into service. That isn't nostalgia. It's a lesson about how Lisle thought. Everyone who came after tried to make guns quieter by adding better baffles, cleverer materials, more elaborate tubes bolted onto weapons that were still, at their core, loud machines. Lisle did the opposite. He didn't muffle a gunshot. He went to the three separate places a gunshot is born: the racing bullet, the bursting gas, the slamming machine, and he refused to let any of them be loud in the first place. He didn't suppress the noise. He engineered a reason for it never to exist. And physics has not changed since 1943. That is why the number still stands. You cannot out-silence a weapon that was built silent from the cartridge outward. If you've come this far, you already understand why these forgotten machines are worth remembering. So subscribe and stay with the series, because the strangest, most brilliant weapons of the last century were almost never the loud ones history put on its posters. Which leaves one last thing worth sitting with. The quietest weapon of the Second World War didn't come from a great arms empire, or a secret government laboratory, or a factory floor stamping out death by the thousand. It came from a mild-mannered civil servant who built silencers in his spare time so he could shoot rabbits without troubling his neighbors. And from the fact that one of those neighbors happened to run Britain's Department of Quiet, Dirty Little Wars. A hobby meant to avoid disturbing a sleepy English field ended up erasing sentries on the coast of occupied Europe and soldiers in the jungles of Burma. And maybe that is the truest measure of what Lisle built. Every other famous weapon of the war earned its legend through noise: the scream of a diving bomber, the thunder of a tank, the roar of massed guns. His earned its place in history through the opposite. Its single greatest achievement, the thing that still hasn't been beaten in 80 years, is that when it did its work, no one ever heard a thing.